Hello everyone, and welcome back to the second part of how we're going to make this simple dialogue system in Unity. I went ahead and created the file for the conversation, but I didn't mess with the class at all. I went ahead and wrapped it in my namespace, of course, but we're going to go ahead and start working on this now. We're going to have some nested classes, so let's go ahead and do that 3 times within each other. And the first nested class is going to be entry, and the next is going to be link, and the one after that is going to be priority. And we're going to change that class for priority to enum because it's not going to be a class per se. And we'll go ahead and fill out the values for that. It's lowest, low, normal, high, and highest. Okay, so you could have it backwards, but this is the way that I want it. And it's going to really play effect later when we actually do the calculations for sorting the list of links that we're going to have on the entry. But all of that will be addressed later. So what we're going to do in this video is create the conversation class and create the link class because they're pretty simple. The entry class is what takes a little while. So we're going to start with the conversation class, but first let me explain why I went ahead and made all these nested classes. The only time I ever want to use this entry class is in reference to this conversation. For instance, this entry class is so specific to the conversation class that if I didn't have it nested, I would call it public class conversation entry, so that you know it's an entry that's in a conversation. But by doing this outside of the outside of GrayMatter altogether, let's just say we're outside of GrayMatter altogether, I would call this conversation.entry, and then I would call this link entry.link, and this priority link.priority whenever I'm referencing anything of those. And that's kind of how I want them because that's the relationship they have. So I'm doing it this way. You don't have to have them as nested classes if it becomes an issue for you. But if it doesn't, I mean, why not do it this way? So let's go ahead and create the conversation class. I'm going to close all of that down. Okay, so the conversation class is going to have a dictionary of ints and entries. Okay, and the reason that I'm having a dictionary, I could just have a list. I could just have a single root entry and kind of follow it that way through a reference, or a reference of a reference of a reference of entries, kind of like how a linked list works, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, don't worry about it. It's not going to be that big of an issue. I could also just have it as a list, but I think the easiest way to store this would be as a dictionary because I'm going to store and reference all of these entries by IDs, and that's going to be using an int. And if I store it, as a hash set of integers, it's not going to allow me to store something with the same integer ID kind of thing, but I don't know. I just think that this is the best way to do it. I'm going to go ahead and call this entries, but the reason I'm doing it like this, where the conversation has a list or a reference to every single entry within the conversation as opposed to the entry having a reference to the next entry, is that the conversation can circle several times. It doesn't just circle. It could also branch out and go straight a different direction. It can be linear in one part of it. It can be a binary tree in other parts of it. And because of that, trying to save a data structure like that could be very, very cumbersome on the system. Not only that, if you did it in XML, it would store every single variable for every single reference to every single entry. And if you had an entry refer to an entry that was already referred to once in your conversation, it's now storing duplicates of entries. And if it circles, it could actually cause like a out of memory error or something. I'm not sure what it would actually cause, but I'm sure it would cause something because it would just constantly be typing that over and over and over and over and over again. There's a lot of errors that could pop up with this data structure, and this is the easiest way I find to avoid any of that. And this might have problems itself. I just can't think of any way better to do it. So let's go ahead and create a constructor, a default constructor for it, and all it's going to do is set entries equal to a new dictionary. And then we're going to have two methods. One's going to add an entry with an int ID and an entry, obviously. Let's see. So the first thing we're going to do is check if entries already has the ID. If it does, this is totally up to you, but I am going to just replace any of the entries that already exist, or the IDs that already exist, with a new entry. So we're going to do mEntries ID equals entry. This might work beneficially later if I go to edit the entry at this ID or whatever, edit the entry, I work on the entry, and then I want to save it back to the same ID. This will just replace it, and that might work pretty well. But I'm just going to set that as my default, action that I want to take unless it has a new ID, which in this case we'll say m.entries mEntries.add ID and entry. Okay, so that's the add entry method. We will be coming back to that later, but for now we're not. So then public entry, we need a get method, and it's just going to take an ID, and we're going. This could return null. That's important to note for later, but we're going to see if it already exists. mEntries dot contains key ID, and if it does, return mEntries at ID, return null. It's probably possible just to say return mEntries ID, because that would return null if it doesn't exist. But I don't know if it says, there's an array out of bounds, so maybe it says key doesn't exist. I'm not sure what error that would actually give. So let's just do it this way. I don't use dictionaries often, but I thought that that was the best data structure to use for this. So that is essentially all that we need to do in the conversation class. So let's go ahead and pull up that link class and create it real quick. So what we need to do is private int mNextID. This is going to be the ID of the entry that the link is pointing to. And then this one is going to be priority. Priority. We're going to go ahead and set up some getters and setters. Public int next ID. You could probably just set these as public variables, but I think I'm going to go ahead and just stick with the doing it this way. This is kind of how I set up all of my classes with the properties. I don't see any reason not to, so I just do it this way. But yeah, I think that's kind of how I'm going to leave it. So if you want to do it differently, feel free, but I'm not going to. And then this is going to have two different constructors. One's going to be just an ID, so next ID. And that's going to call another constructor. And actually, I got to change that to next ID. And then it's going to provide a default for the priority, which is going to be normal. And then close that off. And let's delete all of that. Okay, and then this is going to take a priority. We're going to call it priority. Okay, and this is where we're going to set all the values. So mNextID equals nextID, and mPriority equals priority. So if you're not familiar with how this works, this is kind of how I've been setting up a lot of my stuff lately. It's just going to be like, if you call this constructor here and just provide an ID, it's going to say, okay, well, with that information, I'm going to call the other constructor and provide that ID with it, but I'm going to provide a default value for the priority because I also wanted to set a priority. So instead of defining, data here, or how we're going to handle the data here, and then providing how we're going to handle the data here, we just kind of call it here, and now we only have to change it at one place. So that's how I've been setting it up. You can feel free to set it up any other way, but this is what I think works the best. And with that, the link class is done. So I will go ahead and see you in the next video when we start the entry class.